The Uber had barely stopped when my grandpa frowned, leaning forward like he'd missed something obvious. "Why are you getting out of an Uber?" he asked, his voice cutting through the small crowd gathered outside the house. "Where's the SUV we bought you for your birthday?" The question hung in the air, heavier than it should have been. I felt it before I understood it, eyes shifting, curiosity sharpening. This wasn't a private question. It had been asked where answers become assumptions. I opened my mouth, still trying to catch up with the moment, when my mother stepped in smoothly, smiling like she was clarifying a harmless misunderstanding. "Oh, that," she said lightly. Her sister needed it more. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else looked away. My phone vibrated in my hand, the Uber receipt still open, still visible proof that I hadn't chosen this. My grandpa stopped smiling. And in that pause, I realized this wasn't just about a car. It was about what everyone believed I deserved. If you've ever felt invisible in the place you call home, you know the quiet weight of betrayal. Not the shouting, not the arguments, but the calm, measured way someone else decides your life for you. My name is Alyssa, and until that afternoon, I believed silence kept families together. Standing there, hearing my life being reassigned like it was nothing, I realized that sometimes the cost of patience is too high, and that power comes when you choose carefully when not to speak. In my family, I had a role long before I had a voice. I was the dependable one, the daughter who quietly managed her responsibilities, worked full-time, paid her own bills, and never asked for recognition. I finished college without drama, kept my room tidy, helped around the house, and rarely made a scene. My efforts were expected, not applauded. My younger sister, Maya, was different. She was expressive, dramatic, and unapologetically demanding. When she needed help, the house bent around her. When I needed anything, it was assumed I would simply handle it. When my grandparents gifted me the SUV for my 24th birthday, it felt like acknowledgement, finally, a recognition of all the silent labor I'd put in. Grandpa had insisted on putting the title in my name. "For your future," he had said. I treated the car with care, like a promise. I drove responsibly, paid for insurance, filled the tank, and kept it spotless. But slowly, the boundaries I relied on began to blur. What I gave and what I received were no longer in balance. Gratitude, I was about to learn, often gets mistaken for availability. And availability can come with silent, unspoken conditions no one ever tells you about, until it's too late. The first signs were subtle, almost easy to ignore. It started with comments like, "You won't need the SUV this weekend, right?" Or "Maya's got a longer commute, so you can wait." They were framed as casual reminders, but they carried an undercurrent of expectation. I began noticing changes. Seat positions altered, playlists replaced, gas tanks left low. Once, I came home to find the SUV gone entirely, no note, no explanation. When I called, my mom answered casually. Maya took it. She was upset. You know how she gets. I hesitated to argue. Instead, I documented everything, dates, times, mileage, messages. Not out of defiance, but because something inside me whispered that these little acts were not random. I mentioned it once over dinner. I just need to know ahead of time if the car's being used. My mom smiled, almost kindly. You're too sensitive. It's family. Why are you keeping score? Maya rolled her eyes. It's not like it's really yours. That sentence, quiet and careless, left a mark. I told myself I was imagining things. That families shared, and flexibility was love. But I began noticing patterns, subtle but repeated. I started tracking everything, preparing silently, even while pretending to be unaffected. Not because I wanted conflict. Because something inside me had started paying attention and would not forget. Once they realized I wouldn't confront them, everything escalated quietly, but relentlessly. Maya no longer asked for permission. The SUV became hers by default, gone for days when it suited her, returned only when convenient. I adapted silently, planning my life around her schedule. Ubers, borrowed rides, minor inconveniences I quietly absorbed. Each adjustment seemed invisible, but I noticed everything. My mother defended it effortlessly. Your sister's commute is longer. She's under stress. You work from home some days, be flexible. No one saw that with every word, my privileges were quietly being stripped away. Publicly, the dismissal became normalized. At family lunches, my mother joked, "At least you're saving miles." My aunt laughed, nodding in agreement. Everyone assumed the narrative. The SUV wasn't mine to begin with. At home, the SUV returned slightly altered. Scratches appeared mysteriously. A warning light blinked when it had never done so before. Parking tickets left folded neatly on the dashboard. When I asked, Maya shrugged. Didn't you drive there last week? I didn't argue. I paid the fines. I documented it all, photos, receipts, messages, like a quiet ledger of small injustices. The more I absorbed, the more confident they became. My mother spoke for me before I could open my mouth. My dad avoided eye contact. Maya called the SUV my car without irony. Silence, I realized, is dangerous in the wrong hands. People don't interpret it as restraint. They interpret it as permission. And that is exactly what I had been giving them. The more I stayed silent, the more isolated I felt. At work, I carried the same quiet determination, but at home, the walls seemed to close in. Every family gathering reminded me of my place, the daughter who didn't complain, the one whose needs were always secondary. Conversations about the SUV, once casual, now carried judgment. You're lucky she's using it, someone would say. Lucky? I had worked for that car. It was mine. I started doubting myself. Had I overreacted? Was I too sensitive? Maybe the problem wasn't them, it was me. That small voice of doubt grew louder each day. I questioned every decision, every boundary I tried to set. And yet, amid the exhaustion, I held on to something, dignity. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I didn't act rashly. I observed. I noted patterns. I saved screenshots. I wrote down timelines. Every small disrespect was recorded in the quiet of my room, away from their eyes. No one noticed my endurance. That was the point. If they had, they might have reconsidered. But in their arrogance, they assumed my silence meant consent, my patience meant weakness. What they didn't see was that every act of control they exercised was being quietly documented. Every harmless dismissal, every sly remark, every casual seizure of what was mine, they were building my strategy, even as they thought they were winning. I felt isolated, yes, but in isolation, I was also growing aware. Growing precise. Growing patient. And for the first time, I realized, patience could be a weapon. The moment came subtly, almost like a whisper. Maya announced she was taking the SUV for a week-long trip, her important work project, she said. My parents nodded, supporting her, as if the car had never been mine. My protests? Minimal. They weren't heard. My existence seemed irrelevant in the decision-making of my own family. That week, I relied on Ubers, borrowed cars, and public transport. Every ride reminded me of the loss, not just of the SUV, but of control. I watched my family enjoy the convenience, their laughter echoing from the driveway while I planned my commutes around them. At first, I felt defeat. My efforts, my patience, my quiet endurance, ignored. I questioned myself, had I misread everything? Was I too naive to think my place in the family mattered? Yet even in that apparent loss, I noticed patterns. Maya's arrogance grew bolder with each unchecked act. My mother's defenses were rehearsed, predictable. And my father's silence, long, uncomfortable pauses, hinted at a hidden truth I hadn't yet grasped. It was a social blow, yes. A legal or material one, if I had allowed it. But it was also a revelation. Everything they assumed about me, that I was passive, that I would never fight, was about to be tested. I didn't collapse. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't confront them yet. I waited. And quietly, I began to see the structure of the problem. The patterns. The weaknesses. The leverage points. Even in losing, I was preparing for a reversal they could not imagine. Days turned into weeks, and I continued my quiet routine. I drove myself when necessary, relied on Ubers when the SUV was gone, and smiled when my family assumed I had accepted my place. I never complained. I never argued. I let them believe I was indifferent. Every glance, every comment, every tiny dismissal was absorbed, catalogued, and stored, not in anger, but in awareness. I noticed patterns they didn't. The way my mother phrased things to manipulate perception. The way Maya assumed entitlement wherever opportunity arose. The way my father avoided confrontation, yet subtly influenced outcomes. Every small humiliation became data. Every subtle slight became evidence. I felt isolated, but isolation gave me perspective. I wasn't powerless, I was observing. I wasn't defeated. I was planning. I wasn't small. I was patient. My patience wasn't weakness. It was strategy. And in that patience, I realized something critical. The louder they asserted control, the easier it would be to reclaim it. I learned to smile at their assumptions, nod at their casual arrogance, and let the silence stretch long enough that they forgot I was even listening. By the time they thought they had me cornered, I was already seeing the exit routes, the leverage points, and the mistakes they were too blind to notice. And I understood, finally, that quiet endurance was more dangerous than noise. It started with small realizations, moments that clicked into place like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't seen before. Every time Maya borrowed the SUV, there was a pattern. Every excuse my mother offered had a predictable cadence. Every moment of my father's silence carried subtle influence over the narrative. At first, I had ignored them, believing they were isolated incidents, but now I could see the repetition. The manipulation wasn't random. It was calculated, consistent, and above all, predictable. I began documenting everything meticulously. Dates, times, locations. Screenshots, messages, receipts. I created a timeline of entitlement, a ledger of small injustices. What had felt like chaos now had structure. What had felt like my weakness now became my blueprint. I noticed the arrogance in their assumptions. They believed my compliance meant submission. They assumed my silence meant consent. But in truth, my silence had been observation, my patience a form of power. And in recognizing these patterns, I realized I had a choice. I could continue to endure silently, or I could leverage this knowledge, methodically, strategically, to reclaim control without losing my dignity. The key wasn't confrontation. It wasn't shouting or revenge in haste. It was precision. Timing. Documentation. Subtlety. For the first time, I felt calm. I felt capable. I felt like someone who could wait for the right moment, for the right evidence, for the right impact. I was no longer merely enduring. I was preparing. And I knew that when the time came, it wouldn't just be about reclaiming what was mine. It would be about revealing the truth in a way they could never ignore. While my family continued their assumptions, I quietly built my advantage, one they could never see. I had kept every receipt, every text, every screenshot. The Uber rides, the fuel logs, the parking tickets Maya left unpaid, everything was documented. I cross-checked dates, times, and locations. Patterns emerged, predictable excuses, repeated manipulations, subtle gaslighting. I had a timeline of control and entitlement, all leading back to them. No one knew I was doing this. I smiled, nodded, and accepted their casual dismissals in front of others. I let them grow bolder, let their arrogance peak. Every lie, every overreach, every assumption became ammunition, though they didn't realize it yet. There were witnesses too, though unspoken ones. Neighbors who had commented on seeing Maya take the SUV when I needed it, family friends who had seen inconsistencies in my parents' explanations. I quietly approached a few, not to accuse, but to confirm facts. Everything was aligning. I wasn't acting. I wasn't scheming out loud. I was preparing a revelation so undeniable that it would leave no room for denial. And then I had the final piece, the moment of timing. The one event that would force the truth to surface without me needing to raise my voice. They believed I was still the passive, silent daughter. They thought I had accepted the imbalance. But in truth, I was calm, collected, and fully aware of the power I held. And the audience, the people watching, the family, the friends, would witness the unfolding in a way my family could never undo. I had learned to turn every dismissal, every small humiliation, every unfair expectation into a strategic advantage. What they considered my weakness was, in fact, the foundation of my strength. And soon, everything they had assumed would be reversed, precisely, legally, and publicly. In the quiet of my room, away from their eyes, I began to change. I stopped seeking validation. I stopped hoping for acknowledgement. The car, the unfair treatment, the dismissals, all of it became irrelevant to my self-worth. My power no longer depended on their recognition. Where once I had measured myself against their standards, now I measured only my patience, my strategy, and my timing. Confidence replaced frustration. Calm replaced doubt. Observation replaced reaction. I realized that restraint itself could be a statement louder than any argument. The fewer words I spoke, the more weight they carried when the truth eventually emerged. I practiced composure. I rehearsed silence as if it were armor. I visualized the moment of revelation, the exact sequence in which the evidence would speak for itself. I imagined my family, stunned, unable to argue, unable to explain. And with each passing day, I became less the passive daughter and more the quiet architect of justice. No longer would I allow small humiliations to define me. No longer would I let assumptions of weakness guide their arrogance. No longer would I wait for permission to claim what was already mine. I had transformed. Not through confrontation. Not through anger. Not through shouting. But through patience. Through awareness. Through the quiet accumulation of undeniable truth. And for the first time, I knew, the real power had always been in my hands, it just required that I wait for the right moment to reveal it. I began planning with meticulous care, taking measured steps that would leave nothing to chance. First, I organized all the documentation, the Uber receipts, the fuel logs, the parking tickets, every message that hinted at misuse. I created a clear timeline showing when the SUV was unavailable, who had it, and how often. Every small injustice became evidence, every oversight a proof of entitlement and mismanagement. Then I quietly confirmed witnesses. A neighbor had seen Maya taking the SUV multiple times without informing me. A family friend had noted my mother's explanations were inconsistent. I secured their agreement to speak if necessary, but without alerting anyone. Everything had to remain invisible. Next, I analyzed patterns. Maya's assumptions, my mother's justifications, my father's silence, predictable and exploitable. I mapped out the exact sequence that would allow me to present the truth publicly and legally, leaving no room for denial. Timing would be crucial, the impact had to be undeniable. Finally, I rehearsed patience. I reminded myself that power came not from haste but from restraint. Every family interaction was now a controlled observation. Every dismissal, every sarcastic remark, every underhanded comment was stored mentally as part of the strategy. I was no longer reacting, I was orchestrating. My silence became intentional, my endurance a visible tool for the audience, and my awareness a shield against misjudgment. By the time I acted, they would believe nothing had changed. They would think I was still the quiet, compliant daughter. But behind that calm facade, I was ready to reclaim everything, legally, socially, and undeniably. The SUV was more than a car. It was a symbol of entitlement, neglect, and assumptions about my obedience. And I would turn it into the centerpiece of a revelation they could never contest. Everything was aligned. Every detail accounted for. Every witness secured. And the moment of impact, perfectly timed, flawlessly executed, was approaching. The day I returned to the driveway where it had all begun, the air felt different. The Uber glided to a stop at the familiar spot, but this time, my posture, my composure, my presence carried something they had never expected: quiet authority. Grandpa was there, as he had been months ago, waiting to see me step out. The same confusion flickered in his eyes, the kind that had once made me doubt my own place. But now, he paused, hesitated, sensing that this Alyssa was not the same girl who had silently accepted everything. My mother's smile, confident and rehearsed, faltered ever so slightly. Maya looked up from the car she assumed was hers for the day, fully expecting me to defer, to comply, to shrug it off like before. I didn't. I moved deliberately, each step measured, calm, visible. I had no words yet, only presence. The witnesses I had quietly secured watched, unnoticed by the family, as the stage was set for the moment of reversal. Everything had changed, the location, the dynamics, the anticipation. They believed I was still the passive daughter. They believed my silence meant submission. But the air was charged with the weight of evidence, the quiet power of observation, and the inevitability of accountability. In returning to this space, the same one where my humiliation had begun, I reclaimed my ground, not with anger, but with the certainty of patience, strategy, and legal leverage. And as their eyes met mine, I knew, the moment for revelation was close, and when it came, it would be undeniable. Confidence turned into arrogance, and that is when people make mistakes. Maya assumed her entitlement was absolute. She revved the SUV, parked it boldly in the driveway, and loudly complained about how inconvenient it was for everyone else that she had to leave early for her plans. My mother chimed in, praising her for being responsible and considerate, framing her arrogance as virtue. They believed they had the upper hand entirely, that I was still silent, still passive. They didn't notice the calm in my eyes, the careful timing of my every gesture. Every overreach became a thread I could pull. Every careless word, every exaggerated claim, every assumption about my compliance was recorded, catalogued, and strategically ready to be exposed. Even Grandpa's confusion turned into subtle worry. He glanced between Maya, my mother, and me, sensing the shift in energy he could not name. They were creating their own undoing. I let them speak. I let them act. I let them assume that everything was normal, that I was the same Alyssa who had endured months of unfairness. And in that assumption lay their downfall. Because the more blatant their arrogance became, the easier it would be to expose. The more loudly they tried to assert control, the more undeniable the truth would appear. I remained calm, composed, unshaken. I didn't need confrontation yet. I only needed observation. Their overconfidence, their belief in my submission, and their predictable arrogance were about to become the foundation for the revelation they never expected. Every careless act was a building block. Every confident word was a step closer to the moment when all their assumptions would collapse. And I knew exactly when, and how, it would happen. The moment arrived quietly, without fanfare, yet it carried the weight of months of careful preparation. I stepped forward, holding the folder I had meticulously assembled, receipts, screenshots, messages, timelines, witness statements, all evidence of the months they had assumed I would passively accept. My voice was calm, steady, unwavering. I didn't raise it. I didn't need to. This, I said, opening the folder, is everything that has happened regarding the SUV. I laid out the timeline of misuse, the repeated overreaches, and the mismanagement. Each fact spoke for itself: dates, mileage logs, Uber receipts, parking tickets, all perfectly documented. Witness statements corroborated the events, proving the narrative my family had constructed was false. Maya's eyes widened, the confident smile fading. My mother's cheeks flushed with the recognition of what had been ignored for far too long. Grandpa leaned closer, silent, absorbing each undeniable truth. I didn't accuse. I didn't shout. I let the evidence do the talking. Every claim, every entitlement, every manipulation they had counted on being invisible was now visible, undeniable, and structured. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. For the first time, my family realized that my endurance had been strategy, not submission. My patience had been power, not weakness. They had assumed I would continue to quietly accept the injustices. Instead, I had orchestrated a revelation so precise, so complete, that no defense could survive it. And in that silence, as their eyes met mine, they understood. The balance of control had shifted irrevocably. The reaction was immediate, though not violent. Maya stumbled over her words, searching for excuses that no longer existed. My mother tried to explain, to reframe the situation, but the facts spoke louder than her defenses. Grandpa's eyes were wide, fixed on the evidence I had presented, realizing how carefully he had underestimated the situation. Neighbors, family friends, and even distant relatives who had witnessed the SUV being taken without notice now understood the truth. Whispers spread through the gathering, disbelief mingling with realization. Every casual dismissal, every subtle slight, every assumption of my compliance was suddenly exposed, undeniable in public view. No cruelty was needed on my part. I didn't attack, I didn't humiliate, I let the documented truth stand for itself. Their collapse was social and visible, a consequence of their own arrogance. The balance of power had shifted, and the audience, both private and public, witnessed it unfold. Maya sank into her chair, avoiding eye contact. My mother's confident facade crumbled, replaced with the recognition that her assumptions had led to exposure. Even my father, who had stayed silent for so long, finally spoke, not to defend them, but to acknowledge the weight of the truth. In that quiet chaos, I remained composed. Calm. Collected. I had endured months of subtle humiliation, and now, justice had arrived, not through anger, but through strategy, patience, and undeniable evidence. The SUV, once a symbol of entitlement and neglect, had become the centerpiece of a revelation that no one could ignore. And everyone understood, finally, that assumptions of compliance and quiet endurance could be fatal under scrutiny. The days after the revelation were calm but heavy with consequence. Maya no longer assumed entitlement. Every casual expectation of the SUV now came with acknowledgement of responsibility. My mother, humbled by the exposure, adjusted her approach, learning that favoring one child over another had tangible repercussions. Even my father, who had largely stayed silent, began taking steps to ensure fairness in the household, subtly reinforcing boundaries I had long waited for. Neighbors and family friends, who had quietly witnessed months of dismissal, now offered support in ways that had previously been unimaginable. Conversations that once ignored my efforts now recognized my role, my endurance, and the careful strategy that had led to balance. The SUV remained legally mine, used only with consent and mutual respect. More than a car, it had become a symbol of authority, fairness, and accountability within my family. I, too, felt the shift internally. The quiet patience, the careful observation, the strategic restraint, all had paid off. There were no loud victories, no dramatic confrontations, only the measured, undeniable acknowledgement of truth. And in that acknowledgement, the house, once heavy with assumptions and subtle slights, felt lighter, calmer, and finally equitable. In the quiet aftermath, I reflected on what had truly changed. It wasn't just about reclaiming the SUV. It was about reclaiming respect, boundaries, and the understanding that patience and strategy can outweigh anger and impulsive reaction. I learned that true power isn't loud or explosive, it's deliberate, composed, and undeniable when revealed at the right moment. I realized that endurance, when paired with awareness, can turn injustice into opportunity. By observing, documenting, and waiting for the perfect moment, I had transformed humiliation into empowerment. My family had learned an important lesson: assumptions of compliance, favoritism, and entitlement carry consequences. My silence had never been weakness, it had been preparation. My patience had never been passivity, it had been strategy. And in the calm that followed, dignity prevailed. The balance of respect in my home was restored, quietly, irreversibly. For me, the victory wasn't in shouting or retaliation, it was in quiet, calculated justice. And that, I knew, would remain long after the driveway was empty and the SUV was parked safely at home.